wonder how many of you recall the late Monsignor Knox, far better known as Father Ronnie Knox. He wrote a little collect in the form of a limerick, which is a great favourite of mine. You probably know it. O God, for as much as without thee we are not able to doubt thee, give us thy grace to teach thy whole race. They know nothing whatever about thee. In conferences such as this, the fact that we know nothing whatever about anything whatever impresses me more and more as the conference goes on. And I'm sure that it's very, very healthy for us. And now Professor Ellison may help us to realize that we know even less than nothing. I don't know at all. I see that his title that he has chosen is The Scientific Method and Psychic Experience. Just one personal word of my own before he begins, and that is that the scientific method is not confined to natural scientists. It finds its place in every serious investigation, including theology, and it certainly is not the prerogative of natural scientists. And I think I can say one further thing, and that is that by itself it never suffices. Now, Professor Ellison holds the chair of electrical and electronic engineering. My own ignorance is so profound that I've never been able to discover the difference between what is electrical and what is electronic. However, we welcome Professor Ellison particularly in his capacity as president at the moment of the Society of Psychical Research, for Psychical Research, of which I am a very obscure member. And I find that the membership of that society, together with the membership of this society, is a very healthy combination. Each adds something as a corrective and indeed also as a catalyst to the other. And we're extremely grateful to have the president of the SPR with us now, and I won't stand between you and him any longer. Professor Ellison.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, may I say first what a pleasure it is to be here. I feel both delighted and honored to have been asked to talk to you. And I was so interested to hear our President's remarks at the beginning. The moral I draw is don't tinker with things that you don't understand. We shall see that the scientific method is the right way to approach such matters. You know, for a great many years, members of the Society for Psychical Research were considered dull, negative skeptics, doubting everything, explaining away everything. And you know, well, certainly today, it's not like that at all. If indeed it ever was, I don't think it ever was. Quite the reverse. Scientific psychical researchers, or parapsychologists as they're often called these days, use the methods of science to study psychic experience. They are following the light of truth so far as they can. And I suppose all of us, everyone in this room and members of the Society for Psychical Research too, are seeking reliable, helpful knowledge. Certainly the only reason why I am interested in psychical research is because I want to learn things which will be helpful. That's my major reason. Well, you've heard what my title is. Let me start off by explaining to you, and those of you who are already scientific will forgive me for a few minutes, explaining the method of science. And then I will illustrate how it is applied to psychic experience. The method of science, of course, is a reliable, useful thing. It has led to many useful devices like this device in front of me, that recording instrument, these most useful lights, and the cars that many of us came here in, and many other things. So it's certainly a reliable and useful method. It starts, when we apply the method of science to anything, the start is to assemble the facts, or should I say, assemble the apparent facts, and then check them, verify them, make sure that they really are facts. And then, looking at all these facts, try to devise a hypothesis which seems to fit them. And then to test that hypothesis. If it works, is useful in predicting something, then we're getting somewhere. If it doesn't work, then we have further facts which we must fit into another hypothesis. And the result of this procedure, making sure that the facts are really facts, and working out hypotheses which appear to fit them, testing these, the result of all this is ultimately a theory. A theory which represents experiences that we have. This is very important to realize. A theory is a model representing experiences. It is something which is useful. It is not, repeat, not fundamental knowledge about anything. It is not an understanding of the universe. Scientists do not have an understanding of the universe. They have a series of models representing experiences which human beings have, which work most of the time and are useful in predictions. That is what the so-called knowledge of science is. There's nothing fundamental about it. There are two ways of describing a table. For example, a table is a hard, brown, solid object. That is one way of describing it. Somebody who doesn't really understand science would say, oh no, not at all. It's really a lot of empty space with protons and electrons, electric charges buzzing round each other. Most of it is space and so on. That's what a table really is. Nonsense! Nothing of the kind. To say that a table is a hard, brown, solid object is just as good as to say that it's a lot of protons and electrons and neutrons. They are both useful models which we can use. We use the model that it's a hard, brown, solid object when we put glasses of water on it. We use the model that it's a lot of protons and electrons and neutrons when we do other things in physics labs. They are models which are useful and which represent our experiences. Let me make a brief reference, a very brief reference to a modern American philosopher, Northrop. Northrop says that we have two kinds of knowledge: aesthetic knowledge and theoretic postulated knowledge. And it's rather important to understand this. Let me illustrate simply the difference between aesthetic experience, aesthetic knowledge, and theoretic postulated knowledge. Suppose you have someone who was born blind, and at the age of 21 they have an operation which restores their sight. Imagine that. And then take them and sit them in front of a red letterbox and ask them to open their eyes. They would not say, it's a red letterbox. They would have only the aesthetic component of knowledge. They would have certain experiences in their mind, if you'll allow me to use that term. This is the only thing we know. They have certain experiences. They would close their eyes again, feel it and say, it's a letterbox. then they would open their eyes, close them again, and ultimately would realize that this lined up with what they had understood as a letterbox. People, they'd say, its appearance is different from that grass over there. And you would say, yes, that we call red, the grass we call green. And they would fit this in. And a red letterbox is an item of theoretic, postulated knowledge, postulated in order to make sense of these aesthetic experiences that we have. Now, most of us, and I was going to be a bit rude to some colleagues and say second-rate scientists, are naive realists. They think there's some sort of reality in all these hard, solid objects all around us in physical space. There isn't at all, of course. We all went through this procedure I described in connection with the red letterbox when we were babies. And we opened our eyes and closed them again and did little experiments and discovered our hands and so on. And tables and chairs and other people and our bodies and our brains and our senses, these are all, to use Northrop's terminology, items of theoretic, postulated knowledge. And very useful they are. So we have this so-called knowledge of the physical world, which is like the shifting sands in a way, isn't it? It's worth thinking about that. Let me illustrate how the models of science, which are also items of theoretic postulated knowledge, let me illustrate how these change. You know, up to the beginning of this century, gravitation, it was thought, was fairly well understood. Newton had proposed a model of gravitation which would predict the motions of the planets, and we felt that gravitation was fairly well understood. Well, some measurements were made concerning the motions of the planet Mercury around the Sun, which didn't quite fit the predictions. And certain people thought that the measurements must be wrong. I mean, gravitation is part of our scientific knowledge. The measurements must be wrong. Well, they were very misled. The measurements, the observations come first. The models come second. Newton devised a new model of gravitation. And now everybody uses the Einstein devised a new model of gravitation. Everybody now uses Einstein's gravitational laws, which predict everything that Newton's did and some more besides. And so we have a better model representing our experiences in this sort of area. And that happens all the time. This large number of models which work and are useful most of the time is modern science. These models are changed when they are inadequate. With them we can predict, we can design electric machines and amplifiers and so on using these models that we have. Some of the models which are useful are very curious. For example, in modern physics, time running backwards, parallel universes, negative space. These are sometimes very useful. If they are useful, they are valid. They are models representing experiences. They're very often these days in mathematical form. It doesn't matter if they make sense, quote, or not. If they are useful in predicting occurrences, then they are valid models, and we shall use them until they cease to be so useful. You know, there are two theories of light. There's a corpuscular theory and there's a wave theory, and sometimes one uses one and sometimes another. I'm cutting a rather long and complicated story very short. We don't really know what any of these things really are. We just have models representing our experiences. Remember Northrop. Those of you who have lots of patience and feel like doing some hard work, I can well recommend reading Northrop, The Logic of the Sciences and the Humanities. And his other larger book, The Meeting of East and West, is also very useful. Right then, I hope we have clear now what the method of science is. Observations, checking that they're right, devising hypotheses, testing them, ultimately arriving at theories, models which work most of the time. Now, what about psychic experience? Let me describe one of the models representing the experiences that psychics have, and tell you a little bit about some work which has been done to check that, to see whether it is right. Because if it's right, if it's useful, then we can use it. The model I thought I would mention is this, that we all have an astral body which we live in after death, and which a psychic can see now, and it interpenetrates the physical body and it sticks out all round. And there's an astral world which interpenetrates the physical world and in which we can move around in our astral body. That's the hypothesis. Now, in a seance, then, using that, discarnate people come into the room where the medium is and speak, in quotes, and are seen, in quotes. This is using this model, this hypothesis about the astral body and the astral world that I described earlier. Another use of it would be that when one has an out-of-the-body experience, we go out of the physical body in our astral body and move around in other parts of space. There's the hypothesis then. Now, how can we check it? Because the scientist starts up by saying, so you have this hypothesis. It may be a lot of nonsense. It may not be useful in predicting occurrences, in which case I'm not interested. How can we check whether it's useful or not? An experiment that I did some years ago was to check whether this astral body interpenetrates the physical and sticks out all round and moves around in physical space with us. I grew up using a great many, reading a great many of the theosophical books. The Madame Blavatsky, Annie Besant, Leadbeater type of book, and I read this hypothesis there. It all came here to the West via Madame Blavatsky originally, of course. Well, how do we test that hypothesis? This is what I did. I went along to the SAGB, I'm not sure it wasn't the MSA in those days, and I asked the chief medium if she could recommend a psychic who could see the astral body clearly and who would be willing to work with me. They're so friendly at the SAGB, of course she said immediately, only too delighted, and she recommended a psychic. I asked the psychic back to my room and said, would you please sit there? And now, can you see my astral body? Oh, yes, he said. It was a man. It's sticking out all round, and he described the colours and so on. He said, there's no problem. You can see this clearly. Oh, yes, he said. I said, now I'm going to stand just behind this screen so that my physical body is just covered, but my astral body is sticking out. Can you still see it? Oh, yes, of course I can, he said. I then said, now I'm going right behind the screen. Can you still see it? Oh, no, he said, no, of course not. Then I said, this is the experiment. I'm going to stand near the edge of the screen and further away from the edge of the screen at random times, and I would like you to call out from your observations of my astral body whether I am near the edge of the screen or right behind the screen. Do you think you can do that? Oh, yes, of course I can, he said. There's nothing easier. I do more difficult things than that every day of my life. So I moved near the edge of the screen and I moved further back at random times. And the psychic called out, now you're near the edge. Now you've moved further back. Now you're near the edge, and so on. And there was no correlation whatsoever between his statements and my position relative to the edge of the screen. And I then checked that experiment with about 12 other psychics with exactly the same result. And I wrote it up. It's in the SPR proceedings. It's also in certain theosophical literature. And it's made no difference whatsoever. People still talk about the astral body according to that representation that I described at the beginning. Now, what about this other part of the hypothesis, that people in the next world come to the room of the medium in their astral bodies, and the medium sees them clairvoyantly and hears them clairaudiently? What about that one? Well, Dr. Soul did an experiment on that, I'm sure some of you will know about. Some years ago, Dr. Soul was having some sittings with the trance medium Blanche Cooper, and he seemed to be getting very remarkable, interesting communications, quote, from his deceased brother Frank. I remember one of the statements put through the medium via the control as from Frank Soul was this: do you remember when we were little boys, we both went into a wood and buried a penny underneath a stone? And Dr. Soul said, good heavens, yes. I'd forgotten all about that, but now I remember. It looked like pretty good evidence that his brother was there. But Dr. Soul was a scientific psychical researcher. He went away and he did another kind of experiment to check that hypothesis that I gave you a few minutes ago. He went away and he devised a character he called James Ferguson, a Scot. He imagined the sort of village that he grew up in Scotland, the names of the children around him at school, description of his house and so on, until James Ferguson became very clearly existent in Dr. Soul's imagination. This is the sort of thing that any novelist does, of course, in writing a novel. He then went back to Mrs. Blanche Cooper. Mrs. Cooper went into trance again. The control took over and said, good evening, Dr. Soul. We're very pleased that you're able to come again. We have a new communicator for you this evening. And the new communicator passed on through the control all sorts of facts which proved that he really had lived on Earth. And I give you one guess as to who the new communicator was. It was James Ferguson. And the only life he had ever lived had been in Dr. Soul's imagination. I could go on for hours giving you similar parallel cases, rather similar experiments of novelists who get communications from the characters in the novel. I'll have a little bit more to say about something rather like that, which is very important, occurring at the moment. Things are not quite so simple as we have astral bodies and we go out in them after death and we come to mediums and we communicate and so on. It isn't that simple, I'm sorry to say. I wish it were. A much better hypothesis is that we have an unconscious mind, all of us, with dramatizing capability. I look upon a human being as rather like an iceberg. This is my favorite model. The bit above the sea is the conscious mind, the part that we, I hope, are all using at the moment. The part that writes out laundry lists and does calculations and organizes chats with other people and so on. But there's much more of us, more of the iceberg below the level of the sea, at the subliminal part, as Myers called it. Much more of us. There's the personal unconscious, in which is the memory store. And machinery there, I call this machinery George. George there picks out the memories when I need them and pops them up into the conscious. He seems to be getting not so good at it these days, but that's the idea. Maybe I haven't trained him well enough. So the memory store is there. But there is also machinery which will produce dramatizations. And George produced that clear image of James Ferguson. And most sittings with mediums, when good evidence comes over of the kind I described, very often one doesn't need to look further than the sitter's memory store for a complete explanation. Sometimes the evidence for survival, of course, is very, very good. I'm perfectly convinced of survival myself, but it wasn't on that sort of evidence. Evidence for survival is rather rare. Sometimes, of course, and I don't have time to go on with this today, sometimes, of course, notes of a séance with a medium are rather mixed. Some of the information the medium produces are obviously his or her guesses about possible communicators. Sometimes the memory store of the sitter is the obvious source. Sometimes there are signs of a genuine discarnate communicator somewhere in the background. Sometimes these signs are very strong, but it is not proof to a skeptic. That sort of model isn't much use. It doesn't explain enough things. Well, I don't have time to illustrate much more, but let me say a hypothesis then, or at the later stage a theory, is not much use if it does not cover all the facts. And the one I mentioned just now about the astral plane and the astral body, the astral plane being a completely objective place, rather like the physical world appears to be to someone who is a naive realist. That model of the astral world and the astral body and so on just simply will not do. You know, when one talks about telepathy in connection with a séance, it's a rather rude word, isn't it, to a medium? And many people, many sitters have said to me, "Oh, nonsense, you know, this ridiculous skeptical scientist. I wasn't thinking of it at the time." Well, whether the sitter was thinking of it or not is completely irrelevant. Telepathy takes place at the unconscious level of the mind. It's not what you were thinking about. You've got to have a hypothesis which fits the facts. And you need that one about the unconscious and the dramatizing capabilities. And any communications from the next world have got to come through this machinery. This is where the difficulties are, the distortions that occur, and so on. Let me give you one or two other very brief examples of hypotheses which do not work, but which are widely held. I hope I don't tread too heavily on anyone's particular pet corns, but you invited me, and I must be honest. There are people all over the world who claim to diagnose your illnesses from a blood spot or a sputum sample or a hair. They put it inside a little box and they swing a pendulum or they rub a bit of rubber and they ask themselves mental questions and they claim to diagnose your illnesses. And they sometimes, quote, treat them. They treat their patients by a sort of aerial and twiddling knobs and so on. The language they use is very like the language that I use as an electrical engineer. But it doesn't make sense at all to me. It doesn't make sense at all to an electrical engineer, this language they use. There is no evidence that I can see that there was anything in it. So I did an experiment with some others some years ago. This was the experiment. I got a medical friend to get a number of blood spots from his patients, and about 20 of them. And the experiment was to ask the practitioners of this particular art if they would sort the blood spots into male and female. Well, those practitioners will tell you what is the percentage efficiency of the particular organs in your body. So there shouldn't be any difficulty in sorting out men and women because, as you probably know, some of the organs are actually different. So I asked 20 practitioners if they thought they could sort out random blood spots in sealed envelopes into male and female. They were very helpful again. I think people in these sort of areas are exceedingly friendly and helpful, and they said, yes, we'd be delighted, and of course we can do that. Again, they said we do much more difficult things than that every day of our lives. So the blood spots were put in envelopes, lettered, and then they were given to someone else who put them in other envelopes and numbered them, so that the person sending them out did not know which was which. This is what we call a double pendulum, or his bit of rubber, and so on. We didn't mind particularly how he did it. Then they came back and they went to the next practitioner, and he did the same. These people were all over the world. I remember there was one in Australia, others in the States. And let me summarize a very long story very briefly. Every single one of them got about half of them correct. About half of them. In other words, what these dreadful skeptical scientists would say was a pure chance result. And the second-rank scientists would say, all right, then say there's absolutely nothing in this subject. They talk a language which is meaningless gibberish to an electrical engineer who's supposed to understand about radiations and waves and so on. And you do a simple fundamental experiment and they can't do the most simple thing you can devise. There's nothing in it. Now, that is not so. And please don't think that I have said that, because I'm not saying that. Such people do a great deal of good. They are very helpful to a great many people, and you mustn't rule that subject out quite so simply. But their explanations are quite wrong. That is what is wrong. The model, the theory that they are using couldn't be more wrong, utterly wrong. But sometimes they get useful results, and good luck to them. I was going to say a bit about psychic operations in the Philippines and Brazil, but I don't think I have time. Let me say only most people seem to have a vested interest in the answer they want. The results of experiments showing that their theory is wrong are often completely ignored. Look the other way. I wrote this experiment on the blood spots up and published it. Nobody's taken the slightest notice of it. In fact, I'm finding it very difficult to persuade any other practitioners in this area to do any more experiments. How are we to get to understand, to get models which really do work? And with which we can predict occurrences more effectively if we don't do experiments. We must. That's why I'm so keen to talk to groups of spiritualists and others, which I often do, to try to explain to them that we're all seeking helpful truth. And this is the way that scientific people are doing it. I can't leave scientists out in the implied criticisms that I make. I must have a word about them. Most scientists are not unbiased seekers after truth. I wish they were. And ideally they should be, at least most of the time. They're not unbiased all the time. They know, perhaps I'm letting the audience into a secret, Mr. President, they know very well the answer they hope to get from a particular experiment. Any scientist has to struggle to be objective, to be as objective as possible. But the method of science has a corrective to this human failing. The corrective is publication. in a respectable, refereed journal and later discussion. So if the scientist has done his experiments and they're biased, he knew what answer he hoped to get, and he ignored some of the evidence, then the referees will say he's made mistakes, ask him to resubmit the paper, tell him what the mistakes are. Or if the referees don't pick it up, the rest of the scientists in that particular area will read the paper and say, they will contribute to a discussion. They will write letters to the editor. They will go to meetings and they will say, he didn't do this and his deduction was invalid and he should have done that, and so on. So the general body of fellow scientists puts right the human fallibilities of particular scientists. This is part of the scientific method. Of course, regarding psychic evidence, and that is our subject just now, a few today, scientists are quite fixed in their beliefs, and no amount of good evidence seems to affect them. For how long should one go on trying to convince them? Some skeptics will never be convinced that there is something real here to study because they don't want to be convinced. They are not true scientists, they're really problems for a psychologist. And I'd better not mention any names this morning, but I'm sure you could all mention a few of them. Their idea is that, for example, ESP cannot occur. It doesn't fit all these models, which, as I described earlier, are changing all the time. The so-called scientific paradigm of the universe. ESP doesn't fit, therefore it can't be true. Therefore all the evidence must be wrong. Therefore people who think it's good must be deluded. This is the way such second-rate scientists, psychological problems as they are, argue. Now, let me, in the time I have left, tell you a little more of the scientific work that is going on with into psychism, into altered states of consciousness, as we tend to call this today. Before I do, let me say one preliminary thing. Sometimes it's difficult, I've found this over many years, sometimes it's difficult to persuade a good psychic to take part in scientific experiments. Why is that? Well, they know very well that psychic functioning cannot be turned on and off like a tap. Scientific psychical researchers understand that and wouldn't dream of saying that there's no psychic functioning here as a result of 1 or 2 or even 10 experiments. It's only those so-called scientists who were suddenly convinced yesterday who would draw conclusions like that. Serious psychical researchers, parapsychologists, would not draw such hasty conclusions about psychic functioning from an inadequate number of experiments which don't lead to positive results. Also, we now know very positively today that some investigators themselves are catalysts and some are inhibitors. Some people get good results with psychics in scientific experiments much of the time. Others seem hardly ever to get good results. I've been very lucky as an SPR Council member. Donald West seems to be an inhibitor and he's been very unlucky. We understand these things today. And of course, subjects themselves, people who are being studied, can be divided into what we now call sheep and goats. The people who believe that there might be something in it and maybe it will take place, and the people who are skeptical and say a lot of nonsense, of course it won't take place. And whether the subjects are sheep or goats affects the results of the experiment. We know that now. all this, I think, illustrates the enormous importance of belief when one is dealing with the inner worlds where thought is supreme. I don't have time to more than mention work which I looked at a month or so ago when I was in the States. The work being carried out by Carl Isosis with Alex Tannis and Ingo Swan on out-of-the-body experiences. Enormously interesting, important, valid, sound scientific work, well worth reading. And, of course, the work of Targ and Puthoff on distant viewing is exceedingly important. They have learned, we are all learning, that, well, this is a personal opinion, of course. Everything I say is a personal opinion. We are learning that your experiments should involve the right hemisphere of the brain more and the left hemisphere less. The left hemisphere is the rational, naming, listing, calculating hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the shapes, colours, forms, intuitive hemisphere. And we have to do experiments which involve that more and the other less. Rather than the card guessing with statistics type of experiment, which seems to use the left hemisphere, well, for most people, and which I would have thought was the quickest way to extinguish ESP that I know. We're learning some of these things. I could go on. I want to mention the enormous importance of mental states, and particularly today, physiological correlates of mental states. Because we can now say, by making measurements of brain rhythms and skin resistance, particularly, and other things, that an individual is in a particular mental state, and it's not some other mental state. In other words, psychology is becoming respectable. We can make measurements and say, this is the same mental state as that. Now, certain correlates of mental states, and I'm thinking particularly of those brain rhythms again, voltages measured at electrodes put on the surface of the scalp. Some of those correlates of the mental states that healers are in are of enormous importance to healing. Again, I don't have time to go into that much. You can ask me in the discussion if you like. But a great deal of work is being done on that, and maybe as a result of it, we shall find some hypotheses about healing which work a little bit more often than some of them do already. I think there's time perhaps for me to describe one experiment that I did not so long ago with a healer. A very well-known healer, I won't mention her name, but she was working with a man who was injured by one of the bombs which went off in London a couple of years or so ago. His leg was badly injured and he'd had a lot of surgery, and if this is his leg lying on a settee, this is his foot at the end, he can move it 2 or 3 degrees. That's about all he could move it. Well, the healer was working on him. He was going to see her once a week for treatment, and she held her hands about 6 inches away from his foot on each side of it. And she talked about forces flowing through her. She didn't know what these forces were. They would flow from her hands through his foot. His distinguished surgeons at a famous hospital didn't mind this a bit, because they knew only too well that if the healer didn't actually touch him, there couldn't possibly be any effect. So they didn't mind. So I went along to observe this. The healer put her hands there, and after a minute or two, his foot started to move spontaneously. And it began to move, I suppose, over about 30 degrees, and he was saying, oh, ow, you know. It was physiotherapy, but she wasn't actually touching him. And this was doing him a great deal of good. He'd been going along for this treatment for a year. So I observed this, and it was very interesting, obviously good and useful, and I said, now may we please do an experiment. Her theory, her hypothesis, was forces flowing from her hands. She didn't talk about discarnate healers, I think she talked about God, or some higher level beings of some kind. This was her hypothesis, forces coming from somewhere through her. Many healers use that sort of language. This was the experiment we did. A young nurse came into the room at about that time, and I asked her if she would cooperate. So I took a piece of paper and I wrote down on it, in random order, the healer, myself, nobody. Myself, the healer, myself, nobody, nobody, the healer. You know, these three choices in random order. And I said to the nurse, would you mind taking this piece of paper and giving me a hand? But first, we must do something else. I said, would you mind to the subject seeing if I can do what the healer did? I put my hands there. Absolutely nothing happened. He said, sorry chum, you're just not a healer. You can't manipulate these forces coming from some other level of the mind or the universe. I said, oh well, bad luck, it was worth trying. Now let's continue with the experiment. We put a blanket over the subject so that he couldn't see, right over him. And then I said to the nurse, now will you point to the next item on your list? And I was the first, so she pointed to me. And I went up to the subject, put my hands there. The nurse then said to the subject, please tell me, is it Professor Ellison, the healer, or are nobody's hands there? And he gave her an answer. And then she'd write it down, she would then go on to the next line and perhaps point to the healer, and she would put her hands there, and so on. I wonder if any of you can guess what the result of that experiment might have been. It was quite unequivocal. Sometimes the foot moved 30 degrees when my hands were there. Sometimes it moved 30 degrees when nobody's hands were there, and sometimes it didn't move at all when the healer's hands were there and he said there's nobody there, or it's Professor Ellison. In other words, the subject could not tell whether it was the healer, myself, or nobody. I've done experiments like that. Again, I could talk for an hour on experiments rather like that. What I did at the end of that session was this. I said to the healer, do not tell your subject the result of this experiment. That's point number one, very important. The next point is, tell your subject that you will give him distant healing every night of the week and not just once a week when he comes to see you, because it's clearly doing him a lot of good. That's what I said. And the third thing, which I said quietly afterwards, is, well, I don't think you need go on talking about strange forces flowing through your hands need you. It looks as though the explanation is to be sought elsewhere. But good luck with your work. If you go on cooperating with scientific people, we'll come up with a hypothesis, a theory that really works most of the time. That's just one example of a typical experiment with a healer. But I wanted to, I'm nearing the end, I wanted to tell you, those of you who are not familiar with them already, of the enormous importance of the results of a group in Toronto called the Philip Group. I referred to this in my presidential address to the SPR earlier this year, which I called Mind, Belief and Psychical Research. This is what the Philip Group did. I'll cut a long story very short, and if you're interested, you can read the book called Conjuring Up Philip. The group in Toronto, following certain suggestions made by SPR members in this country, did this. The group, by the way, was led by the wife of Dr. George Owen, who's a fellow of Trinity, Cambridge. I'm sure our president probably knows him. Reliable chap, scientist, and he was associated with this work in Toronto. His wife was the leader of the group, and they had a number of people, including a psychiatrist, and George Owen came in occasionally. One member of the group made up a story. She has some pretensions to being a novelist. She made up a story set in England a couple of 100 years or so ago, revolving around one or two of the large houses in the Midlands. The history of those houses is well known, and the people she made up were not associated with it. So there's no doubt that the story was fictitious. It was a rather lurid story, involving deep emotion. There was a frigid wife, a gypsy lover, a burning at the stake, a suicide after terrible remorse, and so on. This was the story. The lord of the manor, who committed suicide and had the gypsy lover and the frigid wife and so on, was called Philip. The group read history books of the period. They made a sketch of this imaginary character Philip, so that he was clear in all their minds. They meditated on this story, they thought about it, they discussed it together. And then they tried to communicate with Philip, who of course had been dead a couple of 100 years or so, according to the story. And within a matter of months, they got very clear communications. One tap for yes, 2 taps for no. And Philip answered questions. His answers to questions, in general, agreed with the facts of the story. Sometimes they extended it. Sometimes the extensions were not historically accurate and couldn't possibly have taken place. Philip's views appeared to vary with who was present at the séance. If the smoker was present, he toned down his views about smoking. If they were all non-smokers, then he was rather forthright about smoking, so on. This is exceedingly interesting psychologically. The raps are very interesting physically. The variation of the loudness of the raps with time has been recorded with a vibration transducer and has quite a different characteristic from the rap you make if you tap on the table with your fingernail, which is what it sounds like. If the group said to Philip, they imagined he was standing there in his astral body, of course, communicating with them by raps. This is traditional in the spiritualist movement. If the group said, oh, Philip, you're not really there, you know, we've only made you up. You're just a figment of our imagination. We can send you away easily. If they did that, the raps declined and faded away, and they had to build up their belief in Philip again. They had to do mental gymnastics. And when they got their belief nice and strong again, just during the periods of the séance, I mean, they're sensible people, they knew very well that Philip didn't really exist at any other time, but they are getting repeatable, objective results from this. And they repeated it in a television studio, and a whole lot of other groups, I've persuaded several to do this, are repeating this today. Enormously important is belief. If they didn't believe in Philip, he faded away and ceased to exist. There's very interesting work, exceedingly interesting work going on out-of-the-body experiences, exploring parts of this next level of consciousness at the moment, and I don't have time to go into it. But may I conclude by saying this? Clearly, I've scratched the surface this morning of an enormously important and very large subject, and I hope I've shown you the point of view of scientific workers, I want to conclude by saying that the world needs a deeper understanding of life. Young people especially are seeking this understanding in all sorts of ways, some of them undesirable. Thoughtful people, scientists amongst them, desperately need a star to hitch their wagon to. Something more than naive realism, materialism, which is at the background of our ordinary physical scientific paradigm, as I described earlier. Such people need a living, growing, continuously expanding understanding and appreciation of the universe. But they need it presented with good evidence to suggest that it is true. That is, they need the scientific approach in these critical days. It's not much use going to a young person and saying, you've got to believe this and this and this in order to be saved. All of us here in this room wouldn't be here if we didn't agree. I think that is nonsensical. Young people say, well, where's your evidence for it? I'm not going to believe something without any evidence, and we've got to be prepared to give it to them. And it matters other states of consciousness which cannot be studied by the ordinary methods of science. Such people need ways of developing themselves which are more reliable and controllable than are some of the traditional yoga methods which Peter Leggett mentioned earlier this morning. They need perhaps biofeedback, information of those brain rhythms which tell the subject whether they're on the right mental lines. And then maybe they will achieve first-hand experience of states of consciousness which are at present in what the psychologists call by that ridiculous word the unconscious, which is far from unconscious. Psychic phenomena are perhaps pointing the way. By the methods of science, we can now take giant steps into those regions which were until relatively recently explorable by people like me, only at grave risk to our scientific reputations. In fact, we could hardly discuss it at all. Things are changing, I'm very happy to say. And I believe that in the next few years, many warm, open-minded scientists will join us all of us, the psychics and the parapsychologists, in our task, which I think is the most important and fascinating in the whole world. Our task to explore, because this is what it is, the nature of man and his experiences.